So yeah, it's great that uh, Katarina Kolozova was able to join us today. Um, she's a professor of philosophy at. I did practice pronouncing it properly because it's not Skopje, is it? It's
It comes from the Greek word Skopje.
uh
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, so in Macedonia, but
North
I think
Macedonia.
North Macedonia.
Kirill, should I do it myself?
No, 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 no.
Okay.
But I apologize for saying.
No,
Uh,
it's fine.
that's,
I'm joking.
yeah, um, as a professor of philosophy, she's interested in um, various political philosophy, especially um, feminism, and also she's interested in um, epistemology. But I've been for a while interested in project where she's director. She's um, director of the School of Materialist Research, who are an organization that have been doing classes, but also public seminars where a very diverse group of speakers have been discussing the topic of materialism from very different perspectives, very different backgrounds, many not Marxists. So yeah, I'm pleased that we're able to have a discussion about materialism and related themes today. Am I missing anything important that I should have said it, that I should have mentioned? Oh, of course. Well, the very important point, uh, Katerina, is the uh, co-author of a book about materialism. I'm curious to what extent the book was shaped by the ongoing work of the School of Materialist Research. And yeah, we can ask sort of broader questions about that and have plenty of time for discussion after the talk. For now, over to you, Katerina.
Thanks, Kirill. I think I should add a bit more about what I do and where I come from so that there is some background as to what I'm about to present. This is actually the first book of this kind that I've co-written together with Paul Cockshott and Greg Michelson, which deals with the history of materialist philosophy, intertwining with the history of sciences. In a way, we tried to reconstruct a history of Western European, let's call it, rational thought from antiquity to today. Reading into that a certain fundament there, epistemological fundament that necessarily leads to the type of materialism that Marx developed in the end. And before that, I was primarily dealing with the link between Francois Laruelle's non-philosophy. Francois Laruelle is someone very often linked with speculative realism, thanks to Ray Brassier, but of course he rejects the term and the label he rejected. He passed away recently, as does Brassier. So I've been doing that, and this interest in, like recovering the real, it started with that, like more than 10 years ago. At the beginning, I was trying to link it with the questions of gender, feminism, etc. And I published a book with Columbia University Press called The Cut of the Real. And then I continue along this trajectory, which was taking me, while not abandoning Laruelle, along the way, taking me closer and closer to Marx. And in the end, now to the, especially in this book that I'm going to present a chapter from, on the very early Marx, essentially the doctoral thesis, and how we start from there, and why do we start from there. So the book is in a way a defense not only of materialism, but also of the concept of mechanicity. We trace mechanicity. Actually, we take mechanicity not in the Cartesian sense, but in the sense in which one would speak of the mechanical when discussing, for example, Saussure's linguistics, or Turing's notion of computation, or atomism, for that matter, as something that basically indexes genuine materialism, any tendency toward praising organicity of things underpinned by a certain idea that moves them, in the end actually brings you back, even sometimes inadvertently, to idealism. And as Laruelle would say, even philosophy itself does that. And Marx says the same. Philosophy does that. That's why Feuerbach remains an idealist, because he's still a philosopher. He explicitly says so. Writes so, Marx himself. So I think that the links with Ilyenko here are already visible from this brief intro of mine, of my interest and our interest in the book, because Ilyenkov does the same thing by taking two things apart, dialectics, as he would call it, a form of thought, whereas thought is still nonetheless a materialist activity. It's simply the effect, the imprint of what he calls living activity, which is essentially material. So that there is no dichotomy between thought and the real or the material, as it usually is throughout the history of Western thought, or what one would call rational thought, like, or maybe philosophy and sciences that stemmed from philosophy. So there's that, and then the treatment of the concrete and the relevance of the concrete, which is embedded in the material and should condition the form of thought, as Ilyenkov argues, is also something that is close to our interest. It's interesting that I discovered this retroactively when I was revising some of the chapters in this book, and then Ilyenkov entered as a major reference. I was also interested in looking at dialectics as a method, as form or schema, as Ilyenkov would say, of thought, and the fallacies of the Hegelian concept of it. And interestingly, in a book I published in 2019 with Bloomsbury, but nobody knows that it's a Marxist book, because the publisher put animals in the title. I don't know why. Because it's not a book about animals or animal rights. It's more, a deconstruction of the concept of humanity and the anthropocentric worldview, but nonetheless, that's in the title. There I deal also with these same issues, and with the question of mechanicity and its relevance, and the okay, let's not go into that direction, how mechanicity then becomes something that one would call organic. And how come this is so central to true Marxism, I would say. One read of the subsequent interpretations. So some sort of heuristics of Marx's own texts. So it's already there. So it's interesting that I could not establish the relation back then between the two and the relevance of Ilenkov, but nonetheless, okay, that as a side remark or a side remark intro, this should suffice, to give some sort of a hint as to into what direction I would be going with this lecture. And yeah, thanks for presenting the School of Materialist Research. That's really an important project for me, and something that I'm mainly focusing on this year, and will be probably my main institutional focus, let's say, in the coming years. I would just add that as part of this project, I'm also visiting faculty at Arizona State University, which is, on the other hand, the leading institution behind the School of Materialist Research effort. So enough about me, and but it wasn't.
Thanks.
It wasn't just about
just
me.
to say,
it was about what
yeah,
I'm going to
absolutely.
talk about, my interests. So,
well, just a quick thing. That was a great intro, but yet don't feel like you need to read the whole chapter, which is the chapter that we shared. It would be great if if there was like a section or passages you wanted to read, because it would.
No. Of course I will. Of course I will.
Yeah.
You're worried that there won't be enough time, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, I will be skipping parts. Okay, so going back to dialectics and looking at it separately from what one would consider an organic unity, depending on the orthodox Marxist would consider an organic unity, and that would be dialectic materialism or materialist dialectic, whatever you choose to call it. So, okay, let's go back to the roots and what inspired Marx's doctoral thesis, and how that leads us to the question of mechanicity, effective calculus, and in the end, how we use Ilenkov's works to work to sort of corroborate the proposals made in this chapter. This is written by me. Greg and Paul have their own chapters because they're logicians, mathematicians, and computer scientists, respectively. Paul combines both, the latter two. Okay, so you remember, perhaps most of you remember that in German idealism, there is a phrase where Marx says Hegel as one of the great teachers of dialectics. My point here being that Marx refers there, and I believe he has always referred to the dialectical method as we have known it from Greek antiquity. And Greek philosophy was the center of his doctoral thesis. So I'm going to start with a part focusing on this and going straight to antiquity. So it's called Dialectics before its Hegelian reinvention. It is presumably a widely known fact that in Greek antiquity, the term dialectics or dialektike referred to the art, techne, art and craft in translation, as Aristotle calls it in rhetoric. Or, in other words, art or craft technique of correct thinking, one that ought to be the prerequisite and the inevitable characteristic of scientific or psychological, or a philosophical inquiry, philosophical inquiry. Any examination of a matter that could lead to a truthful or accurate conclusion, a logical one, or syllogical, as Aristotle would put it, any pursuit of truth that could call itself philosophical, operates on the premises of what we would nowadays call logic. Aristotle would have called it dialectics. Logike does not appear until late antiquity. And when it does, it is still not in the sense we use the word in our era of modernity. In rhetoric, Aristotle makes sure to distinguish a good argument in the sophist sense, thus not necessarily driven by the love of wisdom. That's the difference between philosophy and sophism, according to Aristotle. So a good argument in the sophist sense from a properly dialectical argument. The latter is concerned with values. He literally says so in physics, Aristotle. There must be values, there must be ethic. So the content should be as it should be, or as we think it's right for it to be. And that is precisely one of the issues on which Elenko criticizes Hegel. The form is there. There is an issue even with the form, but the values and what it's about and what it departs from and where it's supposed to lead from as Aristotle would call it an ethical question. We would call it nowadays a political question. So this was a concern for him as well. So techne, Aristotle would say, is this type of techne in thinking is supposed to operate with values, ethics, etc., unlike the sophists, leading to a skill or art of accurate argumentation, which can be entertained by any individual and not necessarily by a professional philosopher. Or its equivalent in Greek antiquity. So in this chapter, I will attempt to reconstruct the appearance of dialectics as an ontological category on the scene of European philosophy. It seems that the origins of materialist dialectics, as we find it in the communist doctrine of Diamat, can be traced back to Hegel, but not quite to Marx himself. This may seem counterintuitive, or because Marx keeps them apart. That's the point. Materialism, dialectics, and treats them separately in the analysis. So this may seem counterintuitive, or as something that goes against everything we have been taught and have gotten used to thinking on the matter regarding Marxism and Marx's own body of work and legacy. Nonetheless, a closer look at Marx's writings on the dual topic of materialism and dialectics, seen as a unity as well as two separate categories, will show us that his treatment of dialectics has always been closer to that of the ancients than that of Hegel. So especially the doctoral thesis makes this so evident. So we must note a slight exception to this rule precisely in the thesis to a degree, and I will explain how come and in what sense. There we can detect a form of reasoning that operates to a certain and arguable, I would say, degree similarly to the Hegelian model of dialectics, whereas his materialism grounded in the atomist theory contradicts the logic of the Hegel-inspired diamond. Marx's reading of Greek atomism informs his uncompromisingly materialist stance, something we will inspect more closely further on in the discussion. At this point, suffice it to say that the contradiction that underpins Epicurean atomism, according to young Marx, is the product of the properties that define an atom materially and the form that is in the atom's conceptual determination. The latter, however, does not constitute a higher form of truth or purpose of existence causa finalis. It is nothing that would go beyond quite simply being the concept of a material phenomenon, the atom. So there is a process of ideation, human ideation, that would be assigned to the atom in the sense of its ideal form. So sort of tendencies of the atom to move and develop in a certain way are detective, and the concept is the postulate which we project onto the reality of the atom, and we see movements toward or away from it. But that is the concept already in the doctoral thesis. So even here, we cannot say that Hegel is present in the senses in which one would expect him to be. So always already embodied and never endowed with an ideality or participation in a greater and all-encompassing idea. Ideality is thus not an idea, but a perfect form of the material whose predication in terms of property is necessarily an aberration from the ideal form, or simply the concept, as Marx put it. The concept is abstracted from the concrete, but does not reside in a realm of ideality. It cannot inhabit any other universe but that of materiality, because there is no such world. We will therefore look at the two categories, materialism and dialectics, as distinct and unilateral. This would be an Eulerian intervention. Always look at things unilaterally in terms of unilateral difference, as distinct and unilateral to one another, without the canonically presumed unity of the two when it comes to the Marxist tradition of thought, be it scientific Marxism or philosophy. Marx will lead us retrospectively to look for the scientific origins of materialism. Or, yes, the origins are scientific as something that would be in a way distinct from philosophy proper or metaphysics, let's call it that, but still within it, because we're talking about Greek antiquity, and sciences fall under the umbrella of philosophy as well in Greek antiquity. So he will lead us retrospectively to look for the scientific origins of materialism. Materialism proper should always be scientific, that's the point. Or for the origins of the materialism that is closer to a scientific mode of inquiry than to a philosophical theological one in Greek atomism. So he's looking for this in Greek atomism, or more specifically that of Epicurus and the famous Epicurean philosopher, thinker, author Lucretius Clarus. I wouldn't say here, as Thomas Nail would, that we only have Lucretius and the rerum natura, and we should speak of Lucretianism instead of Epicureanism. All Greek philosophy is made of and made up of or reconstructed from different sources and fragments of different sources. And if Lucretius says that he is an Epicurean, if we are rigorous classical philologists, we treat Lucretius just as we would treat Plutarch, for example, as a source. So, plus we have Cicero, who precedes in his accusation of Epicurus for essentially the mechanicity in his thought and non-ideality, by proposing the concept of the swerve, which is the central topic of Marx's doctoral thesis. We find this accusation in Cicero preceding the rerum natura. So this conversation as something coming from Epicurus was already there even before the production of the rerum natura. Okay, so before we do so, let's revisit the question of dialectics in Greek antiquity and the possible roots of its evolution to the Hegelian understanding of the term, and then the Marxian understanding of the term. So, dialectique, mechanicity, and materiality of cognition. Talking about this in terms of Marx and a little bit in terms of Wittgenstein, nonetheless, treating texts from Greek antiquity or Greek philosophy as the material that we're discussing here. So, in dialectic, mechanicity, and materiality of cognition. In encountering philosophical discussions of the Greek notion of dialectics, in particular the one in use in Aristotle's works, one often becomes bewildered. How could the practice of debating, or rather the culture of public polemical exchanges that took place in and was typical of the Greek polis, be confused, but it's not confused, that is simply its origin, with logic, the art of thinking worthy of the attribute philosophical or nowadays scientific. So how could this mundane daily practice part of Greek political culture be in fact the source of logic, as Aristotle argues, without using the term logic, of course, but he refers to his categories, to the organon, to the categorical system, and still logical form of thinking, the one that I presented at the beginning. So, so how can this be confused, these two things? Yet, we do not believe it is a matter of confusion, but of formalization of the observed practice of dialectical exchanges through the abstraction of its rules. So there is a procedure of abstraction on the part of Aristotle, on the part of the sophists, on the part of those who developed the techne of dialectical or logical thinking. So we are already witnessing cognitive human activity that is in the last instance defined by matter and does not constitute an ontology in and of itself. So that is what we're witnessing in this apparent confusion. Abstraction of its rules, or simply deduction of the laws of thinking accurately, as Aristotle would call it. So we're simply noticing the laws of thinking accurately or in line with a consistent pursuit of truth. Thus, similarly to Marx's treatment of the concept of the atom or of its form, Aristotle abstracts the ideal form of what we would nowadays call logical thinking. it is as if a mold of the observed material reality is detached from its foundation, and by way of applying the art of dialectical thinking, its image or form, eidon, right? Eidon, idea comes from eidon. Eidon means image. Its image or form further formalized as concept, like Marx's concept of the atom. So he derives it in a very similar way to the way in which we assess here that Aristotle abstracted it from the daily practice of dialectique, the art of dialectique or dialectical exchanges. So its image further formalized as a concept, like Marx's concept of the atom, very much like Wittgenstein's Maßstab in the Tractatus. The concept is the product of a correct way of thinking, as Aristotle argued in physics. 214a, line 12, 214a, line 16, actually from there to there, those 4 lines of the text, or the dialectical, or, sorry, this AI is imposing it on me, offering its services to summarize my chapter. Okay. Or the dialectical or syllogistic way of thinking discussed below through a close reading of passages from Aristotle's rhetoric. The art consists, so the art he's talking about, the techne, by the way, it's the same term used in his poetics, technes poetikes, his work on art and tragedy. So every artifice, which is a product of human activity, be it art, be it technology, be it even language, because it is a device that is almost mechanically construed to mediate in social relations, to become the tool of social relations, which is mediation, communication, right? And also taming of nature or domesticating nature. So all of this is techne, interestingly, in Aristotle. Art is techne. There is a techne, which is dialectique techne of logical thinking, which is the backbone of philosophical proper thinking and as well as scientific. So anyway, this art consists in being capable of discerning the real syllogisms, which are those of dialectique, from the illusionary syllogism, which belongs to rhetoric. Okay, this is a quote in Greek. I'll skip it. Or in English, okay, there is a translation. This is an art to discern the real and the apparent, and it means the real and apparent of persuasion, just as it is the function of dialectic to discern the real and the apparent syllogism. That is why, even if the form is not an issue in Hegel, even if it wouldn't be an issue, you cannot just turn it upside down and imbue it with matter and then it's fine. That's why it's the form itself is problematized here, and as most of you know, probably in Ilienko's work as well. Okay, so dialectics, as used in Aristotle, concerns the pure form of syllogical thinking, universally applicable to any subject matter. As already said, it is a meta-science that he has, in fact, called art. I just explained why and how come. I will skip this part. So emptied of the pursuit of truth, it will remain rhetoric, dialectic, or the professional logicians, as Ilyenko would call them. If their pursuit is one emptied of truth, or as Aristotle would say ethical, moral, political concern, and if this concern is upside down, even the model of thought is a problem in and of itself. So emptied of this, and that is what makes it dialectical enough to serve proper scientific exploration. We end up with the practice of sophism, as he proposes and problematizes. Now, in order to have enough time for some conversation, I will have to skip a lot of this chapter and this part of on Grundrisse, and go directly to the Ilyenkov part, I presume. I'm guessing that's what would be of most interest here.
Katarina, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should have told you at the beginning, we usually do this, we don't go on for more than an hour and a half, so if you could start to wind up, that would be really helpful, so we got plenty of time for discussion.
Oh, well, let's have more time for me to finish the presentation and less time for discussion, because I didn't know this.
We should have said, but if you can you do it in another 10 minutes, because that will leave us at least for half an hour for discussion. Sorry to
okay. I didn't know that I had to dedicate half an hour of this on discussion. Let me find then the closing part. I'm not sure I'm going to finish it in 10 minutes. Maybe you will have to give me a bit more, and we will have about 15 minutes for discussion, 15, 20. Because I won't give you enough material to discuss if I wrap it up in 10.
I mean, everybody's had the text for two weeks already, so they've had it sent. So people should have read the text by now, if you're worried about that.
See what you can do, and yeah, we'd like to have as much time as we can.
Okay. The foundations of Tiamat, and I'm skipping this part. Let me see. The foundations of Tiamat and their contradictions. So after more than a century of Marxism and the centrality of the notion of dialectical materialism, it is quite a challenge to demonstrate that the compound notion of dialectics and materialism was not the cornerstone of Marxism in its original form. And it still is, and it's very difficult to prove this in discussions. It's such a reflex to think of them as a unity. We can admit that both are relevant in Marxist thought, but they do not necessarily have to be thought of as a unit, not just unity. So it was not the cornerstone of Marxism in its original form. That is Marxist form. And that he viewed dialectics and materialism as distinct categories, not necessarily and unavoidably constituting a unity. His method of moving away from the abstraction, which is in fact a vague philosophical generalization, to arrive at the concrete, only to extrapolate another new form of abstraction, would not allow for a mixture and an amphibology of method, nor a claim about an ontological foundation of reality, that is, of dialectics and method respectively. Much of what followed in this strange detour from what we argue was Marx's original intention is probably indebted to the legacies of Diemat, both as consolidated by the Comintern and as the official party doctrine of the USSR consolidated after Lenin's death. In Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Lenin praises Ditzgen for coining the notion of dialectical materialism, which is a proof that it was not in circulation for a long time prior to Ditzgen and Lenin's notice of this. Thus, having produced a proper materialism, one practiced by way of the method of dialectics or as materialist dialectics, to be considered as an important addition to Marx's and Engels' original doctrine. In this treatise penned by Lenin, we see one thing very clearly. Marx is not presented as the thinker who developed the dialectical materialism, but rather as the one who offered grounds for it to be developed by Ditzgen. However, Lenin's use of the method of dialectical materialism is not centered on constituting an ontology of the classical Stalinist type, but rather serves to refute subjectivism as inherently idealist and prefer a defense of Marxism as uncompromising materialism. The triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis and thus the reconciliation of materialism and idealism is neither Lenin's object of interest nor his objective in the title at issue. So Ilyenkov's reading of both Marx and Lenin proves that the kernel of Marx's, and for that matter, Lenin's materialism is the creation of an episteme allowing for thinking in terms of the concrete and constituting thought of objectivity. In Ilyenkov, concrete is therefore a form of conceptualization, one determined by the material and shaped objectively, which is achieved, which is visible in a passage I just skipped, but was quoted is quoted as at length here. So, which is achieved through assuming a third party's perspective, as per Marx's method. Of course, we cannot think and project that we are in the shoes of that third party, but we can mime the position of the third party, thereby creating of ourselves as well an object of observation. Hence, Marx's objectivism is one that is so distinctly different from Kant's, for example. So, a third party's perspective as per Marx's method. While it's the identity of the last instance can be an abstraction akin to Zon-Rettel's notion of real abstraction. Put differently, in Laruellian terms, its material can be of transcendental nature, similar to the notion of Laruelle's transcendental or philosophical material, whereas its effects are real. Not only are they real, they're also underpinned by a compound of material determinants grounding a structure of meaning similar to what Wittgenstein would call Maßstab, or in English, scale of the real, or the notion of the syntax of the real as developed by Laruelle. Then I go on to link this discussion and Ilyenkov with Zon-Rettel, because there are so many similarities there. But as I have to stop now, I will just stop. I don't know if there is one final time for one final passage as a conclusion.
Sure. Yeah.
So, So just a quote from Zonrettel so that the conclusion makes sense. So this is from Zonrettel, and he says the following: fetish concept of logic has a different social referent with regard to the fetish concept of value. The latter refers to the antagonism between capital and labor, the former to the antithesis between intellectual and manual labor. The two are connected in a genetic sense. This is a term used by Zonrettel, not my term. And in arguing so, he retains orthodox fidelity to Marx. He says, the exchange value form is affirmed as abstraction, albeit treating it as determining reality, akin to the notion of social relations, for example. The abstraction in question does not become real through any kind of general intellect being objectified or realized. Such reasoning would imply the fallacy of reification. The dialectics between use and surplus value is at the core of capitalism. It determines wage labor as commodified. It determines every commodity for that matter, and its very logic of auto-acceleration. So from commodity, money, we arrived at money, commodity, money, and then money prime, M prime, the formula of acceleration in Marx. And interestingly, this formula is used to demonstrate an analogy, is used by Ilyenkov to demonstrate an analogy between concept engenders concept, idea engenders idea, dominating matter, and thus creating, as he calls it, surplus value, completely detached from the reality of human activity. So he makes this analogy and calls it applicable to the Hegelian concept of dialectics. And that is why I'm citing this passage here. This would be the determination of the last instance of capitalist universe. It is in that way, indeed, that economic production determines everything in society. It is the beating heart of a universe of social relations that recreates the same model of subjectivation in all forms, ranging from art and science to the organization of kinship and intimacy. I'll stop here. Sounds like sort of a closing passage. So we don't have much time, but I think this is enough.
Thank you very much. I appreciate. We should have.
No, I presumed that I would have an hour and then half an hour of discussion. So
yeah, it's great that now we will have time to discuss. So hopefully you'll be able to kind of unpack a little bit more. So many of us here are dogmatic Hegelians who are sort of delighted the
that's
opportunity.
why you're so keen on discussing.
But it'd be great to have a question that is kind of engages with the substance of Katarina's thesis and kind of opens up the discussion more broadly. If you do have a question, it would be great if you could raise your hand or okay, so Ralph for the first one, and then it would be great if we could take two more after that.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Everything that you said in your oral presentation was comprehensible to me, that mirrors the parts of your chapter that I found logical and understandable. And the reason I found that up to that point was because I read the first 3 chapters of the book. And then I reread your chapter and understood the arguments about Aristotle and so forth, antiquity. and mostly the arguments about Marx's doctoral dissertation. But there is a point upon which you lose me. I really don't have any inhibition against seeing the separation of dialectics and materialism, since I don't have those bad habits that you're talking about dogma. But I do find that I do have a problem, several problems in comprehending your logic and your assertions. First of all, I don't see any real evidence that you can base everything else you say about Marx, about political economy onwards, from the arguments of his doctoral dissertation. And also the point at which you begin to lose me is where you begin to quote from his methodological introduction, which is associated with the Grundrisse. I see that Marx there is making an epistemological statement. So that I do understand. And I could understand how that's epistemology and not ontology. But I also don't see how that corroborates in any way a relationship to mechanicity or atomism. Secondly, the following two paragraphs about Laurel and Hui are basically incomprehensible to me. And I would also say that many of the other quotes about Feuerbach and other Marx quotes, I don't see those corroborating your basic line of argument. So while it makes sense to me up to a point, I really do not see the conclusions that you come to about mechanicity, about atomism, or for that matter, about the actual influence that Hegel actually has upon the Grundrisse and afterwards. So those are my initial issues, because those are the parts I would like explained. And of course, they were not the things that you really discussed. You discussed what I already understood,
Yeah.
but you didn't discuss what to me doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, those were the parts that I had to skip. So I did not discuss them, indeed. Okay, I wrote the second chapter as well. So out of those 2 or 3 that you read, I wrote about half of it, I guess. I think that if you read the parts on Turing, on computation, so the subsequent chapters, it will start making sense. Perhaps seen in isolation like this, these passages do not make sense. I will try to explain why they're important and how do they prove the mechanistic argument. First, Laruelle is quoted there, Saussure is quoted there, the thesis is chosen as relevant precisely in order to prove the mechanistic argument as the core of materialism proper. And of course, Turing, I don't know if I'm quoting him in this chapter, but his method is also a method of mechanical or mechanistic effective calculus. So Saussure is mentioned there in order to illustrate how come language is a mechanical device. Even though we think that there is something authentic in language, in our verbal expressions, in our written expressions, etc., there is beauty, etc., and there is indeed. Language is the product of certain mechanical rules as to how a phoneme comes next to a phoneme, how they combine, departing from the very simple rule of differentiation, relation, and arbitrarity, etc. And from this very simple principle, all of the mechanical laws of how a word is formulated, then a sentence, So phoneme, morpheme, and the syntax itself, all of this is derived through this almost mechanical rules. So it is a proof that even though something seems so natural, so, you know, like having a life of its own, it's kind of just emanating its true essence or substance or whatever the essence of this thing is, like, you know, language itself, or that, or this language, or it departs from something very mechanical, laborious, and material. And as long as you can explain things departing from that position, then discerning the patterns, let's call them the patterns or laws of how this functions, and then abstract the principle, the form, or the scheme or schema, as Ilenkov calls it, you are actually not carrying out a materialist research proper. I believe that the practice of Marx's analysis itself in Capital is the demonstration of this. He always starts with descriptive analysis of, I don't know, the price of wheat and the price of this and that, and then the laws are extrapolated from this discussion. And then we know the formula, we know the laws of contradiction that he discovers, and then we can move on to the next level of an epistemological, even metaphysical discussion of what he finds there as the laws of capitalism, and also the reasons as to why it needs to be overcome, which are of philosophical nature, essentially, according to me. Laruelle is there because Laruelle also helps us split the two, dialectics and materialism. I had to invoke an authority who does that. His take on Marx is of that nature. So, and according to him as well, we operate with materials which are never put in a unity that makes sense. There is always an affirmation between of the radical foreclosure between the concrete or the material or the physical and the abstract or abstraction, which is thought. Laruelle calls it thought, and the only way, but he's not a postmodernist or post-structuralist. He does not affirm the foreclosure like the post-structuralist does, and everybody's happy then. Everything is a sign, everything is a construct. No. Again, the human being is in a way this almost mechanical radical dyad between the real of the bodily, the physical, etc., and this artifice of language or thought that it operates through. So all of this is piling up, and further on in the book we arrive at Turing and Boltzmann and the others, in which we find the same trajectory of thought. That is why we believe that the doctoral thesis and the choice of atomism is purely mechanistic argument. If you read the second chapter on Parmenides, which I wrote, you can see there that the Epicurean atomistic refutation of the impossibility of movement and change is purely mechanical in mechanistic terms. So, and materialist as well. So, yeah, it may seem like a very strange, combination of sources and what the hell are all these names doing here in one place. But we had to assemble all the names that and writings that could serve to corroborate this thesis. Now, you're saying you're not convinced. I trust you. I trust it's not as convincing as it should be by this chapter, but I hope that the book as a whole is more convincing than I was today.
Thanks, Katarina. So yeah, if others do have questions, they don't have to be extended critiques or anything. It's fine to have a question that's a small question for clarification or anything like that. Joanne, you want to unmute yourself and go ahead. Yep, great. You're unmuted now. Oh no, you've muted yourself again.
But there's some questions in the chat.
Joanne, you did already unmute, and now you're muted again. Meanwhile, yeah, if others do have a question, they're welcome to type it or. Okay, and now we can hear you again.
Oh, yep. Right, great. I think it's wonderful going back to the original Greek sources for more information about, broadening the subject, because lots of Greek philosophy was lost for a long time, and some remains quite obscure, and it takes scholars to rediscover this and articulate it. And I also have a point about Diamat that I think I would see Diamat as being taking dialectics in an ontological direction. I think that's what was suggested. But I mean, Diamat was a dodgy dossier, in my opinion, because if you understand the history of how it was put together, that's perfectly obvious. But getting down to the question, I think it's on page, where have I got it here? Page 9 of the extract and page 67 of the book. The word sublimation occurs. Now, I think that might be a typo because it surely should be sublation, as English as
yes, yes, you are correct.
Yeah. But I'd like that to be clarified because I think sublation for me is an important part of the use of dialectical logic.
Of course, you're right, and it's sublation. And I was shocked to discover not just this typo, but more typos, even though there were like 3 checks of the proofs. The third being the final proof, and there's still errors. It's Bloomsbury, it's supposed to be super professional, but yes, it's an error. It's ablation. You're correct. Yeah. It's supposed to be.
Thanks.
Yeah. Can you elaborate though? Can you elaborate what you mean?
Yeah.
What's ablation mean? Why it ceases to be relevant to Marx?
Because sublation is a different type of resolution of the contradiction. It's completely different from thesis synthesis, antithesis synthesis, where you get a happy unity of the 2 contradictions. It's vulgarization, basically, of the logic of sublation. The logic of sublation is, you as Hegelian know something far more complex, and of course there is a remainder of the previous stage that stays in the state of resolution of the contradiction and kind of provides a foundation for it. So Aufhebung, right? So it's something completely different, and I don't know where this sublimation appeared from. It's supposed to be sublation, yes.
Okay, any other questions?
The copy editor must have corrected me.
Thanks. Great. Joanne, if you can mute yourself again, and then.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see if anyone else. Otherwise, I will ask one myself. I'll go ahead.
May I ask, please?
Yeah.
Thank you, Katarina, for your interesting point of view. But I have a problem for myself. What reason motivated you to divorce Marx with Hegelian logic, dialectical logic? Why?
Because I have an issue with idealism.
And
Because I think that idealism is essentially capitalism and vice versa, but that's very complex to elaborate here. I've written an entire book on this.
but
I'm also inspired by Marx himself. Marx dedicated so many writings to refuting Hegel's philosophy as idealist, and his idealism and his subjectivity-centered thinking, producing what, as he calls it, the universal egoist, if you remember in the early writing. So, I mean, there are many reasons to go after Hegel, and they are Marx inspired, and they should be Marx inspired. It shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, he is criticizing him. Why wouldn't we, the Marxians? So I don't know.
Thanks. Yeah, a quick question from me. So I think one difference between kind of recent approaches to materialism, the new materialisms, and yeah, many of the people who identified with and the original movement that Ray Brassier started around realism, speculative realism. There's a difference. Well, of course, yeah, Ray is a Marxist, but certainly the new materialists aren't. And one difference with Marx is labor. So I wonder, what role does our active transformation of the environment to what is material play in your book? So for me, when Marx talks about materialism, it's really important that partly it's not at the level of sort of that Wittgenstein talks about language games or the sort of pursuit that Aristotle's up to, but it's labor as the transformation of the environment, which things are material.
Well, Ray's kind of rediscovering Marxism, let's put it that way. When we met ages ago, when we were young, he was into Laruelle. That was his thesis, and linking Laruellianism with, analytic philosophy. But yeah, he was a materialist. That's correct. And in a way, he was a socialist, but I wouldn't say the thesis and the doctoral thesis was a Marxist one. And when we became friends around 2002, 2003, he was, like completely into Laruelle with whatever became Nihil Unbound. So I don't think that we can look for Marx or treatment of labor, the concept of labor, in speculative realism. I don't think we will find much discussion of that there, apart from Alberto Toscano's discussion on real abstraction. But, it disappears soon after this movement was declared or whatever. Manifesto, what was it? It was a manifesto, right? So labor is central to non-philosophical Laruelle-inspired Marxism. In his introduction to non-Marxism, which is his version of Marxism, Laruelle's version of Marxism, non-philosophical Marxism. So it's a shorthand for non-philosophical Marxism. Laruelle argues that there are just two types of social philosophy-inspired theories that can be radicalized to be led or transformed, actually, led to becoming or transformed into some type of sciences that are not philosophical, that do not have the problem of philosophy that Marx actually identified as a problem. And he insists that these two types of thought, of radical thought, are Marxism on the other hand, and psychoanalysis on the one hand, and psychoanalysis on the other hand. And in Marxism, he insists that in order to read Marxism of everything philosophical that creates a problem, like, you know, this love for Hegel, for example, we have to focus on the radical concept that defines Marxism and what is Marx all about. And Laruelle insists that that is the concept of labor force. So labor. So even according to Laruelle, labor is at the center of it. And a radicalized Marx would be Marxism that grapples with the issue of labor and waged labor in particular.
Thanks. I would have asked you about what you think is a similarity between Ilienkov and Sonriefel, but I think Karina has something first to say. Go ahead, Karina.
Well, I don't want to ruin that trail of argument, Carol, if you...
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's fine.
Yeah.
Katarina can come back to it.
And thank you, Katarina. It's amazing to delve into these questions, because we haven't really discussed them. This question of materialism, in this you know, in the way that you've raised it in these discussions we've been having over a period of time. I obviously, I think we all, being Alienkovites, we all agree that diamat is an abomination and a dogmatization of a complete version of dogma, and it can't actually be treated as serious philosophy. And even if you don't like the word philosophy, it can't be treated as serious philosophy, because it is, as we, you know, it's just a learning by rote, really. So we don't, you know, to see Soviet or to see Marxist view of dialectics through those spectacles would be it makes no sense, because it was never really a serious philosophy in the first place, even if it was imposed on millions of people. So that's why I don't, you know, the fact that Marx didn't didn't write in detail about this as philosophy, I think is not really the point, because his entire approach to history is dialectical. It's a history of struggle, a history of the conflict, history of overcoming of those conflicts, and development of new types of, or, you know, different types of society and so on. I mean, it's dialectical in its very essence, and I don't think Hegel was, obviously, you're right, we all know he was an idealist, but he certainly had an enormous contribution to make. And I'm just wondering why there doesn't seem to be much of a reference or a discussion about Lenin's notebooks on Hegel's logic, which he did actually also discuss in some, or look at the ancient philosophy, Aristotle, the Eleatics, the skeptics, and there's lots of notes of Lenin on Hegel's and he's Lenin. Can I just finish? Lenin is very he shows a huge contradiction in Hegel's thought, that at one point he comes very close to materialism and he is almost a materialist. At another point he's talking complete nonsense, and Lenin doesn't spare him at all for his nonsense and his rank idealism. But the fact that Hegel had this contribution to make to philosophy, I think is indisputable, even if one disagrees with it. The fact that you're right, he did bring in ontology. He brought in ontology. That's absolutely correct. But there's those of us who think that was a very big contribution to the history of thought, to show that the importance and the dialectics of ontology, the movement within ontology itself. So anyway, thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there is a lot on the notebooks and on logic, and but it's toward the end of the book, and it's written by Greg Michelson, who is a logician and mathematician and also a Marxist. So that is discussed. It's just not discussed in this chapter, and I completely agree that Marx is a dialectician. No one is saying that dialectics is something irrelevant in Marx's work. It's just that this combination of the two and like reconciliation of Marxism with Hegelian dialectics is that presents a fallacy and a problem, and that's why we decided to look at both concepts, or in one case method, in the other case ontology, I guess, separately. In response to the sorry, just a second, my dog fell, just a second.
Well, anyway,
Okay,
I guess
he's okay. So of course it's important dialectics. We're just looking at it separately from this dogma. We're trying to reconstruct the influences, especially from the Greek philosophers, on Marx, and the way we think that he operates dialectically with the through the dialectical method. And so yeah, now I need to cut my response short, but yes, I'm in agreement, and I just want to affirm that it is, of course, we recognize the relevance of the dialectics, and we are dialecticians ourselves. It's just that the way it's usually understood is not the way we think that Marx used the method or conceived of the method. That's all.
Yeah, so a quick question and then one more, especially if you haven't asked a question yet, then that would be your priority. Yeah, so just briefly, what for you is the kind of similarity notice between Alfred Sohn-Riefel and Ilienkov?
Well, I think that you read Ilienkov very differently from me, and both of them acknowledge that there is such thing as concept, there is such thing as thought, but both of them offer an epistemological response which remains faithful to the materialist premises and succeeds to explain how abstraction moves, operates, functions, albeit still grounded or determined by laws of a certain ontology. I'll call it an ontology that is materialist. So this would be a very brief response. I have a much longer paper on a comparison between the two. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, so priority, if you haven't had a chance to ask a question, that would be great if someone else took this opportunity. Could be a broader question about your materialist project. No, okay, go ahead then, Olga.
Thank you. I would say some days ago, Andrei Maidansky told us at the conference that he has found an amazing text in Ilyenkov's archive. Some pages. This text arose when his sector decided to publish a book of materialistic dialectics. And as Hegelian logic stood on the top of the head, they started to find materialistic legs. and some of them offered some project of materialistic dialectics, and Ilyenkov too. He made a sort of draft and then gave up. And a year later, when he defended his doctoral dissertation, someone asked him, what should we change in Hegelian logic in order to make it materialistic dialectics? And this asking was not completely honest. It was even dangerous for Ilyenkov. But Ilyenkov plainly answered, nothing. Of course, we should eliminate some idealistic fiddlesticks, but principally nothing. That is about Ilyenkov. What do you think about your link between Ilyenkov and your rejecting of Hegelian dialectics after that?
Maybe, well,
it's a really long question. I think I answered in the first response.
I'm not sure, if there's much to respond to for Katarina. Okay, final opportunity for, okay, you can go ahead, Ralph.
I do have one question. It's a very simple question. I was just wondering if you were familiar with the Poznan school of scientific idealization, because that school in general had linked Marx to Galileo in terms of scientific method. I don't think they were necessarily anti-Hegel, but they were very interested in the concept of scientific idealization and likening between Galileo's scientific method and Marx. I was just wondering if you were familiar with it, because, you know, that's one of the things we're obviously concerned about, including, of course, that quote from Marx's method that's usually considered a preference to the Grundrisse. That's my question. Otherwise, I would just have some bullet points to add. I do like your, and the only thing I will say was, I understand what you're trying to do about the relationship between the concrete reality and abstraction as a process of thought. I think that's the very important thing. In terms of the way you're executing it, that's to be discussed further. But I'm just wondering if you were familiar with the Poznan school.
I am familiar, and it's I think it's the next chapter. It's the 5th chapter of this book that deals with Marx and Galileo. It's written by Paul Cockshott. So,
Thank you very much, Katarina, for your time. And